Hello again, everyone. I'm Jose de la Torre, and I will be the moderator for this session. We're extremely fortunate to have Jared Diamond with us today to talk about COVID-19 and other crises. Mr. Diamond is an extraordinary polyvalent scientist who's had a number of very successful careers in his life in very different fields. It's an extraordinary achievement. He began as a professor of physiology at UCLA Medical School, and later on developed a second parallel career as in ornithology and ecology, specializing in New Guinea and the nearby islands. Later, in his 50s, Diamond developed a third career in environmental history and became a professor of geography at UCLA, his current position. He is variously described as a geographer, a historian, an anthropologist, an ornithologist, and has drawn from a number of these fields in his research. He's the author of extraordinarily popular science books. One of them, Guns, Germs, and Steel, published in 1997, won the Pulitzer Prize for that year. In addition to that book, he's recently published Collapse in 2005, The World Until Yesterday in 2012, and most recently, last year, Upheaval. In Upheaval, How Nations Cope with Crisis and Change, Professor Diamond examines whether nations can learn from crisis in the way people do. And the nations he considered in his book included Finland, Japan, Chile, Indonesia, Germany, Australia, and the United States. He brings, as I said, an extraordinary experience to us today, and we are delighted to welcome him and to say to Professor Diamond, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to our group. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with Professor Diamond.
Good morning, everybody around the world. I'm Jared Diamond, talking to you from my home in Los Angeles, near my university, the University of California. The windows of my house are tightly closed now because there are major forest fires burning all around California. The sky is gray. Thousands, tens of thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes, and these forest fires are due ultimately to climate change. Even before the forest fires, I was remaining in my house. Why? Because of COVID. In California, there are thousands of cases, thousands of deaths due to COVID, and COVID is still spreading in California because there are many foolish people in my state who are not staying in their houses, but are going out of their houses, walking on the beaches without masks, and infecting each other. So that's the world in which I live, a world of climate change, a world of COVID. I'll explore with you today the question, how might COVID cause our world to change for the better? And your first reaction to that question is likely to be, what an obscene idea, what a crazy idea. How could a disease that kills people and that is shattering our economies and our societies create a better world? That's certainly my own first reaction, because my wife and I are still in a state of shock from the deaths of 5 of our closest friends in the last few weeks, friends whom we had treasured for 50 or 60 years, friends who are irreplaceable. And so, yes, it is indeed an obscene idea in the presence of all these deaths to look for any good in COVID. But what will the world be like next year when we shall probably have vaccines against COVID? Of course, COVID is not the first plague, the first epidemic, pandemic in human history. There have been other plagues before COVID. A famous one was the Black Death of 700 years ago that killed off about 1/3 of the population of Europe. It weakened the Mongol Empire by preventing travel between different parts of the Mongol Empire and led gradually to the empire's collapse. The Black Death contributed to China throwing off Mongol domination. So those are big effects of that disease. Other famous plagues of the past have been smallpox and measles, which European explorers carried around the world, infecting and killing Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians and Pacific Islanders, because those non-European peoples had no history of exposure to smallpox and measles. They had no genetic resistance, they had no antibody resistance, whereas the Europeans who brought those diseases had long exposure to smallpox, and so they had some genetic resistance and some antibody resistance. Smallpox and measles then were selective diseases. They selectively killed Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians while killing fewer Europeans. And in fact, smallpox and measles contributed to the collapse of the strongest empires of the New World, the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, because smallpox introduced into Mexico by European explorers, spread throughout the empire, killed the emperor himself, killed the son of the emperor, killed half the population of the emperor. And so far more Native Americans died in bed of European diseases, of European plagues, than died in the battlefield from European guns. Those plagues of the past then killed lots of people. They created empty land. They affected the outcomes of battles. They changed history. They damaged trade and damaged economies. With all those plagues of the past then, what's different about COVID? In many respects, COVID is quite an ordinary disease. Yes, COVID is easily transmissible by coughing and by contact, but what's called its case fatality rate is low. Case fatality rate means the number of people infected with COVID who will die of it. The case fatality rate is on the average about 2%. It's higher for older people like myself. It's higher for people in poor health. But on the average, the case fatality rate from COVID is 2% of infected people will die of it. That's low. That's much lower than the case fatality rate for smallpox, or for plague, or for Ebola, or for Marburg. Those diseases, those really bad diseases, kill between 30% and 70% of their victims. Or AIDS and mad cow disease kill 100% of their victims. COVID kills only 2%. That's why I say COVID is a relatively mild disease. Why then is this mild disease having such a big effect on us? And why are we so frightened about it? There are three reasons why COVID is frightening and why it's having such a big effect. Reason number one, COVID is spreading between countries by jet planes. In the past, until recently, there were not jet planes. And so the Black Death spread by people walking and moving on horseback and by ship, not by jet planes. COVID has spread rapidly around the world from its emergence only last December. COVID is more transmissible than any disease of the past because of jet airplanes. That's one reason why COVID is terrifying. A second reason, the world population is much higher today than at any time in the past. Today, there are nearly 8 billion people There are more people alive on Earth today ready to be infected by COVID than at any time in the past. 10,000 years ago, there were only 1 million people in the world, 1 million potential victims of any disease. So COVID is terrifying because there are just more of us ready to be killed. And thirdly, COVID is frightening because everybody in the world is susceptible. In the case of smallpox and measles carried by Europeans, Europeans and Asians and Africans had some resistance to smallpox and measles. But COVID is a new disease. No country has resistance to COVID. Everybody is at risk. Everybody infected will have deaths from COVID. So those are reasons why this otherwise mild disease is having such a big effect on us and why it's so frightening. We can do the numbers. What's the worst case scenario from COVID? Today, the world has about 7,700 million people. Suppose that everybody in the world gets infected, and that's quite possible because jet planes and movements of people are already spreading COVID around the world. COVID has reached almost every country, and in time it will reach every country. So it is likely that most of the world's 7,700 million people will get infected. If 2% of those people, 2% of the world's people, get infected with COVID and die of COVID, 2% of 7,700 million means that there will be 154 million deaths. That's the biggest disease death toll in history. That's our prospect. But most of the world's people, 98% of them, will be left alive. Out of the world's 7,700 million people, suppose in the worst case, 154 million die of COVID. That still leaves 7,546 million people alive in the world. That's enough to ensure the future of the human race. COVID certainly does not threaten human existence. Instead, what's unique about COVID is not that it threatens human existence. It doesn't. Instead, what's unique about COVID is that for the first time in world history, people everywhere will be forced to recognize and to acknowledge that all of us, everybody in the world, faces a global problem that demands a global solution. Jet planes guarantee that no country will be able to solve its COVID problem by itself. Just as long as the virus exists anywhere in the world, any country that temporarily succeeded in eliminating COVID within its borders will just get reinfected by travelers from other countries that haven't eliminated it. That's why I say that COVID is a global problem demanding a global solution. No country can keep itself clean of COVID. It will just get reinfected. And you know, you've read, you may have experienced that there are countries that recently cleared themselves of COVID. They had no cases. New Zealand became COVID-free. Vietnam became COVID-free. China became COVID-free. Australia became COVID-free. But all those countries that became COVID-free have gotten reinfected. And that illustrates that COVID is a global problem demanding a global solution. No country by itself can protect itself against COVID. No country will be safe until the whole world is safe. We recognize that COVID is a problem because it kills its victims within a week or two. And if you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID and you didn't die of something else. But as I said, even in the worst case scenario, COVID will kill only a small fraction of the world's billions of people, and the world's economies will recover. That's why I say that this terrible disease is really a minor problem compared to the three really big global problems that kill people slowly and unspectacularly, and that threaten to destroy our economies forever. All of you know what those three big, really serious global problems are. Those global problems that dwarf COVID in their significance. You know that those three big problems that people talk about a lot are climate change is one of them. Unsustainable use of world resources is a second of them. And the consequences of inequality among the peoples of the world is the third of these really serious problems that dwarf COVID. So let's talk for a moment about these other more important problems and how COVID may, I hope, inspire us to solve these really important problems. First, climate change. It's familiar to you. Climate change results from greenhouse gases, from the burning of fossil fuels, consequences of climate change, which means on the average global warming, on the average the world getting warmer, are droughts, as are happening now in California and in many parts of the world, droughts and rising temperatures. But droughts and rising temperatures mean decreased food production and famines, risk of famines. Why is it that there is has been this terrible civil war in Syria? That seems to be a consequence ultimately not of politics, or not just of politics, but of climate change, of drought in Syria. You might think that warmer temperatures and high carbon dioxide levels would be good for agriculture. But no, they're not good for agriculture, because warmer temperatures and carbon dioxide stimulate the growth not only of the crops that we want, but they stimulate even more the growth of weeds that we don't want and that outgrow crops. So climate change is a problem for the world's food supply, and climate change is already creating famines. Climate change, you know, creates extreme weather. Why is it that last week, Los Angeles, my city of Los Angeles, experienced the highest temperatures in Los Angeles history? That's an example of climate change. All around the world, there are extreme events. Warm temperatures, in some cases, even cold temperatures, are a consequence of climate change. So climate change is producing extreme weather. Climate change is damaging and destroying the coral reefs that are so important. Climate change acidifies the oceans, but that destroys coral reefs. Why do we care about coral reefs? Well, coral reefs are the barriers that protect our coasts against tsunamis. And so with the destruction of coral reefs, we're already more at risk from tsunamis. Also, the coral reefs of the world are the breeding grounds for the world's fisheries. They are the nurseries of ocean fish. But ocean fish supply the protein for almost half of the people in the world. You know that climate change also causes the spreads of diseases. Tropical diseases, as it's getting warmer, are spreading to the temperate zones. And so Italy, the temperate country of Italy in Europe, Italy never had tropical diseases like Uganda's onion fever. But this fever that was confined to the tropical country of Uganda has spread to Italy because of climate change. And dengue and malaria are spreading because of climate change into the temperate zones. And then finally, climate change is causing rising sea levels by melting the glaciers and melting the polar ice caps. So there's more water in the oceans. Ocean levels are rising. An example is that the country of Bangladesh, one of the world's most populous countries, recently 1/4 of Bangladesh was underwater because Bangladesh is a low-lying, flat country. And that meant that 40 million people in Bangladesh had their homes inundated because of climate change. Other low-lying areas of the world, the Netherlands, the eastern coast of the United States, are also at risk, Florida, from rising sea levels. So those are examples of why climate change is one of the world's three really big problems, a problem that threatens all of us, that can destroy our economies forever, that in the worst case scenario can ruin life, can maybe even kill all of us. Much more serious than COVID. That's one, then, global problem. A second of the serious global problems that dwarf COVID is the decrease in essential natural resources on which we depend. We humans depend on natural resources for our livelihood. Many of those resources are what are called renewable resources. Trees produce more trees. Fish produce more fish. And so these resources can renew themselves and be available to us forever, provided that we don't chop down all the trees and kill all the fish in the world. But we humans are in the process of depleting the world's supplies of renewable resources. The renewable resources include, of course, trees and forests. We depend upon trees and forests for building materials, for wood, and for paper. Trees, adult trees, produce seeds, produce baby trees, but they can't do that if we're chopping down adult trees too fast. In fact, the world's forests, as you know and as many of you have seen, are shrinking. Similarly, fisheries. Adult fish produce baby fish. We eat fish. As long as we don't catch fish too fast, adult fish can produce more baby fish, and we will have fish forever. But we are over-harvesting most of the world's fisheries, with the result that we are depleting the supply of seafood that provides protein for something like 1/3 of the people around the world. Other renewable resources that we are depleting include topsoil. Soil around the world is being eroded away, damaging world agriculture. And then another renewable resource that's being destroyed is fresh water. The world's rivers, most of the world's rivers, are now utilized by people. They're dammed, they're used for irrigation, they're used for water supplies. Only about 15 or 20% of the world's rivers are left unutilized, and they're unutilized because they're in remote places like Northern Australia or Iceland. You might say, fresh water. We'll always have enough fresh water. We can always make fresh water from seawater, but that requires energy. And the world is running short of energy. So no, we cannot make up for our depletion of fresh water by making it from seawater. That requires energy, but we're running out of world fuel resources. So a second world problem that threatens the world's economies forever and that threatens the livelihoods of all of us, besides climate change, is depletion of world resources. And then the third of these serious problems that dwarf COVID is inequality. Inequality around the world. There are rich countries and there are poor countries. Within rich countries, such as my country, the United States, there are rich people and there are poor people. In the past, before globalization, rich countries were not threatened by the fact that there were also poor countries in the world. But now, because of globalization, rich countries cannot avoid being affected by poor countries. What are the effects of inequality? You know the effects. You've experienced, you've seen the effects. Inequality results in support for terrorists. Every country has its crazy people. The America had its crazy terrorist Timothy McVeigh. Even Switzerland, even Norway has had its crazy people. But in the United States and Switzerland and Norway, Most people are not desperate. They don't support terrorists. In poor countries where lots of people are desperate, they are willing to support terrorists. And so inequality has as its consequences the support of terrorism around the world, which threatens rich countries as well as poor countries. Inequality around the world also contributes to emerging diseases. When a new disease arises in a country like the Congo, when AIDS, for example, emerged in the Congo more than 40 years ago, the Congo does not have an advanced system of public health as Europe and Japan and the United States. And so the Congo was not able to stop AIDS at the beginning. AIDS spread around the world. More recently, Ebola has threatened to spread. Marburg has threatened to spread. Mad cow disease has threatened to spread. And so inequality around the world means terrorism, support for terrorism. It means emerging diseases that spread from countries not rich enough for their own public health systems to deal with these diseases. And then, of course, inequality drives immigration. There are billions of people around the world now who, thanks to globalization, thanks to television and thanks to cell phones, know what the lifestyle is like in rich countries, and they don't want to wait a generation or a couple of generations in the hope that their government will bring wealth to their poor country. They want wealth now for themselves and for their children. And in order to get wealth, they are immigrating to rich countries in unstoppable numbers. So immigration is a big issue in the United States today. It's a big issue in Europe. It's an issue even in Australia. Those then are the really serious problems that dwarf COVID. The problems of climate change, unsustainable depletion of essential resources, and inequality. But why have we not mounted global responses to those really big global problems in the way that we now are mounting a global response to COVID? These other problems are more serious than COVID. Why then are we not tackling these really serious problems in the way that we're tackling COVID? And on reflection, the reason is obvious. COVID kills us quickly and unequivocally. Climate change does not kill us quickly and unequivocally. Yes, climate change kills people and it ruins our economies, but it does it much more slowly than does COVID. And when people die of the consequences of climate change, they don't connect it to climate change. Why is it that now tens of thousands of Californians are at risk from forest fires? Ultimately, it's because of climate change. But all of those Californians who have already been burned to death in forest fires and whose homes have been destroyed by forest fires, they say, my relatives were killed by fires. My house was destroyed by a fire. They don't say I was destroyed by climate change. So COVID commands our urgent attention. Climate change doesn't command our urgent attention. A pause. Continuing then. So COVID kills people quickly and obviously. Climate change doesn't kill people quickly and obviously. But climate change, like COVID, demands a global response. Climate change cannot be dealt with country by country any more than COVID can be dealt with country by country. Climate change is due ultimately to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Is there any way that one country by itself can reduce the carbon dioxide levels in its atmosphere and not worry about the rest of the world? Of course not. Suppose Turkey or suppose China tried to reduce the carbon dioxide levels over Turkey and over China to reduce the risk of climate change to Turkey and China. That's impossible because the world's atmosphere is mixed. No country can reduce its own atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and protect itself against climate change as long as carbon dioxide levels are rising in the atmosphere over the rest of the world. Climate change then, carbon dioxide, is mixed around the world just as COVID is mixing itself around the world. COVID and our global war against COVID are teaching us a lesson that we can learn for climate change. The cruel fact is that we were not prepared for COVID. We should have been prepared. In 2002, COVID in December emerged from wild animal markets in Southeast Asia. But in 2002, there was already a disease that emerged from wild animal markets in Southeast Asia. That was SARS. And then MERS emerged. In 2002, we should have recognized that SARS emerged from wild animal markets. More diseases were going to emerge from wild animal markets. The markets should have been shut down, but they weren't. We were not prepared for COVID. We could have been prepared if the wild animal markets had been shut down. And as long as they exist, and as long as there is trade in wild animal markets, COVID is not going to be the last emerging diseases. Even if we develop vaccines for COVIDs, there are going to be new COVIDs unless we get prepared. The cruel reality is that you know from your own experience, most of us individuals and most countries respond to crises after the crisis has arrived. Couples, husbands and wives, facing a marital crisis, they're more likely to recognize that they have a marital crisis if your wife or your husband says to you, "I want a divorce and I'm walking out." That really catches your attention much more than do slowly developing problems. And so marital crises catch attention when they blow up. Well, COVID also caught attention when it blew up. We were not prepared for COVID, just like most people are not prepared for marital crises. An exception in the world, a country that does prepare for everything, is the Scandinavian country of Finland. Finland does prepare for everything. Finland had face masks stockpiled years ago before anybody knew of COVID. Why is Finland prepared for COVID? Well, Finns learned their lesson. Finland, between 1939 and 1944, fought a terrible war against the Soviet Union, which greatly outnumbered Finland. And Finns' trade with the outside world was cut off. They couldn't import anything. They didn't even have fuel for cars. Their cars had to burn wood. And the Finns learned their lesson. The Finns are now prepared for everything. The Finns stockpile face masks. They stockpile fuel. They stockpile grains. They stockpile medicines. They stockpile chemicals. And so, of course, they stockpile face masks. The government of Finland has councils that meet every month and think of everything that could possibly go wrong and plan for it. So Finland, because of its experience, is prepared. Finland has learned to be prepared. I hope that COVID will also teach the world to be prepared because we were not prepared for COVID. And COVID then may teach us a lesson to be prepared for these other serious problems, to be prepared for climate change, to be prepared for resource depletion, to be prepared for dealing with inequality. My hope then is that COVID will be a teacher. COVID will be a cruel teacher. It will teach us by killing so many of us, by damaging our economies. But by next year, when hopefully we will have vaccines, I hope that our global response to COVID, our learning that this is a global problem that has to have a global solution. I hope that we will generalize from COVID, and we will thereby learn finally to mount global responses to climate change and to resource depletion and to inequality and to those really big global threats. If that happens, if we learn to generalize from COVID, then despite COVID having killed so many dear friends for my wife and me and for so many of you, and despite the tragedy that COVID is wreaking in terms of deaths, and despite the tragedy that COVID is bringing to our economy, my hope is that the tragedy of COVID will cause our world to change for the better by teaching us to be prepared and to seek global solutions to global problems. And on that cheerful note, that's the end of what I would like to say to you. And we can now take time out for questions and concerns.
Thank you very much, Jared. And I would like to perhaps present a couple of questions that have come in already. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
All right. One question here, it's a little long, but let me work through it. It says, Justinian's plague is perhaps more similar to what we face now, as opposed to the Spanish flu. Back then, there were economic issues, food shortages, and of course, political problems as well. And the combinations of these events saw the fall of the remains of the Roman Empire. Are we better able to deal with this pandemic now, or due to the speed of change, are we less able to deal with it? And related to that, same question from the same individual is saying, and is our response to COVID actually a major contributing factor because of not knowing how to deal with the issue?
Those are great questions to begin with. So the plague of Justinian in the Roman Empire was probably a plague due to smallpox. It reduced the population of the Roman Empire. The book that my leisure reading nowadays is in the Italian language. And I just finished reading a book in Italian about what happened to the Roman Empire as a result of plagues such as the plague of Justinian killing so many Romans, with the result that Rome had to foster immigration of barbarians. So yes, the plague of Justinian contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. Are we better able to deal with COVID now than Rome was able to deal with the plague of Justinian? Yes, of course, because the plague of Justinian was due to smallpox, but we have vaccines against smallpox. We don't yet have vaccines against COVID, but quite a few countries are working on developing vaccines. And so we have the prospect for being better able to deal with COVID than the Roman Empire was able to deal with the plague of Justinian. And then your final question, and it's a key question, is our reaction to COVID making COVID worse? Of course, the reactions of some people to COVID are making COVID worse. I will talk only about my own country. I will talk about California. In California, although we've been warned, there are so many people going out on the beaches, hugging each other and not wearing face masks. And that, of course, spreads COVID. California is not the only country where foolish behavior on the parts of people are spreading COVID. So the answer to your last question, is our response to COVID making it worse? The response of some people, of many people to COVID, yes, is making it worse.
And a related question is COVID more dangerous than the normal seasonal flu in terms of its mortality?
Good question. Does Is COVID more dangerous than the normal seasonal flu in its mortality? Probably not. The mortality due to COVID, the best estimates now are 2%. The mortality due to flu is higher than that, but we now have vaccines against flu. We don't yet have vaccines against COVID. And so flu is not as terrifying as is COVID. But flu mutates. Every year we need a new vaccine against flu. We don't yet know whether COVID mutates rapidly. We do know that vaccines against flu protect us for many months, maybe for a year. When we get vaccines against COVID, we don't know whether those COVID vaccines will protect you for a year or several years or just a few weeks. So in short, flu without vaccines kills more people than COVID, but we do have vaccines against flu. It remains to be seen whether COVID in the long run is going to be a bigger danger or a smaller danger than is seasonal flu. Good question.
Here's another issue that has been raised by one of the participants, which is the question of preparedness that you referred to in the case of Finland. There is a cost in being prepared. The stockpiles you spoke of are expensive, and there has to be a political will to invest in these stockpiles, which requires some sort of I guess, agreement in society that this is an expenditure of public funds that is worth undertaking. Why is it that Finland is able to do that and other countries perhaps are not willing to undertake such investments in preparing for the future?
Your last sentence, that's a great question. Your last sentence involved two words. You began the sentence saying, why is Finland able to do it? And then you said, why is Finland willing to do it? Every country is able to do it. Only Finland was willing to do it. Yes, preparedness involves costs. It costs something to buy all those face masks, and it costs Finland to buy grain and to stockpile fuel. But those face masks 3 years ago were really cheap. As any of you who goes out now and buys a face mask, the face masks now in stores may cost $7. 3 years ago, the face mask cost a few cents. And so Finland has experience. What does it cost for Finland to buy and store those face masks and chemicals and medicines and fuel and grain? Finland pays for those costs by adding a tax on petrol, on gasoline. And that tax is, I believe, a fraction of a cent per gallon of gasoline. So the cost, yes, there is a cost, but it's a very low cost compared to the much greater expense of face masks and gasoline when you run out of face masks and run out of gasoline. So Finland has learned that it saves money by being prepared. And why did Finland learn? And why did the United States not learn? Because Finland had the bad experience of being invaded by the Soviet Union and having all their imports cut off for 5 years. The United States has not had that learning experience. And so Americans are not yet willing.
You were mentioning the difference between COVID and some of the other crises that are more existential in terms of their impact, such as climate change, inequality, and the unsustainable use of resources. There's a similar analogy that occurs in terms of one's health. If you get a heart attack, you know that you have a problem and you rush to the emergency room to try to deal with it. If, however, you're overweight or you have diabetes, you postpone it. It's not that critical. You can still function, and you may not take any action until perhaps later on it's too late. The situation with some of these global existential crises is similar to that. And the question is, how do you motivate nations to actually come around and try to devote the resources that are necessary to solve this very long-term, not immediate, where the consequences are not immediate, such as climate change. Although in that case, we are perhaps seeing more and more consequences, as you described in the fires in California, or the hurricanes, or the famines and food production problems.
That's a very general problem, the problem of motivating people to take care of their health when their health is threatened by something slow moved by the consequences of obesity, and getting people motivating nations to take care of crises. The British author Samuel Johnson of the 1700s had a gift for phrases that really catch attention. And Samuel Johnson said in 1700s English style, "Believe me, sir, when a man knows that he is going to be hanged in 2 weeks, that really focuses his attention." Well, that's similar with our health. If we are just overweight, we're not going to be hanged in 2 weeks. We're likely to die of being overweight a few years from now. It doesn't catch our attention. Whereas if you feel a heart attack, that does catch your attention. Similarly with problems of the world, slow developing problems of the world don't catch our attention as effectively as does rapidly developing problems of the world. But just as Finland is a nation that reacted to problems, there are also groups of nations that reacted to problems. In Europe, so I was born in 1937 and I lived through World War II. And I visited Europe in 1950 after World War II. In the 1950s, European governments did not wait for World War III. They took action to prevent a World War III by forming the organizations that were the precursors of the European Union. And Konrad Adenauer and other European leaders said explicitly, we're not going to wait for a World War III. We're not going to wait for a crisis. We're going to take action in advance of a crisis. So in the case of COVID and climate change, what might motivate people to be prepared? COVID. COVID is a teacher. I'm a teacher at the University of California. COVID is a great teacher. I do not teach my students by killing them. COVID does teach people by killing them. And my hope is that next year, enough people will have been killed by COVID. Do I say my hope? My hope is that enough people will have learned next year that COVID is a teacher, that they will not wait for another emerging disease, but they will take action.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience? There are almost 200 of you out there, but I don't see any questions on the question board. Can you please type in your questions so that we can try to address them?
I'm happy to ask a question, if I may, whilst I'm listening. Professor Diamond, you've outlined the problems and suggested ways that we might improve the outcomes for all of us. Education is an enormous challenge, and particularly the education of women around the world. And I wondered if you would like to say a few words about that as being possibly, as I see it, part of the solution as well to some of the problems that you have so eloquently highlighted.
Education and the role of women, interesting subject. Because I graduated college in the United States in 1958, there were strong obstacles to education of women in the United States in 1958. My mother, who was an educated person, a great linguist, a great pianist, my mother did not have a career ahead of her because of obstacles to the education of women in the United States. When I first came to the University of California, my first class that I taught was in 1966. And I remember well my first class at the University of California. It was a class of medical students. There were 62 medical students. And of those 62 medical students that I taught, 58 were white men, 2 were white women, 1 was an Asian man, and 1 was an Asian woman. So there were severe obstacles to education of women in the United States in 1966. Nowadays, the University of California admits students based on ability. And when you admit students based on ability, the result is that we have a majority of women in our classes. There are maybe 55, 60% women in our classes at the University of California. So education for women is opportunities for women are improving. I would mention one example much further around the world. In the country of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a really poor country. And in Bangladesh, Bangladesh had a problem of exploding population. Today, Bangladesh, which used to be part of Pakistan, has a nearly stable population. Why? The role of women. Industries offered jobs in Bangladesh, manufacturing jobs. Those jobs didn't pay much money. They paid $2 or $3 a year, but women in Bangladesh got those jobs, and it meant that they had money. They did not depend upon their husbands for money. And when Bangladesh women got jobs paying them $2 or $3 per day, the first thing they wanted to do with the money was to buy birth control and family planning. And so Bangladesh has stabilized its population thanks to these opportunities for women. Those then are examples of education and opportunities for women and what women can do with their freedom around the world.
Thank you. Jose, I'm not sure that you're seeing all the questions that are coming through. I've got a few more here.
I don't see any more though, David, so why don't you ask them?
A question from Jesse Hurst. What recourse do developing countries have in preparing for COVID-like pandemics in the future when they are so dependent on the actions and support of developed countries?
What will it take to prevent the emergence, the spread of diseases like COVID in the future, given that developed countries are the ones that have the most money? Well, emerging diseases like COVID have tended to spread, to emerge from poorer countries with poorer public health systems, with less well-nourished people more at risk of diseases. COVID spread from China, which is an emerging country, but China is not as rich as is Europe and as the United States. Ebola and Marburg emerged in Africa. AIDS emerged in Africa. What can rich countries do? Rich countries in their own interests can contribute to the development of public health in poor countries around the world. A disease that has already emerged, probably the most serious disease in the world today, is malaria. Malaria is the disease that imposes the biggest economic drain on the world and that kills more people than any disease in the world. But malaria is a disease that is relatively easily controlled by bed nets. All you have to do is provide people in tropical countries with bed nets impregnated with insecticide. That costs money. It's estimated that it would cost something like $30 billion to control malaria and also AIDS around the world. That $30 billion, poor countries of Africa are not going to be able to produce that $30 billion. But $30 billion is a bagatelle for the United States or Japan or for Europe. And so the United States and Japan and Europe could come up with those $30 billion to solve the problem of malaria. But malaria is a disease that most strongly drags down the economy of Africa. But I mentioned earlier that poor countries today create problems for rich countries in this globalized world. So it would be a selfish act on the part of the United States and of Europe to contribute that $30 billion in order to deal with malaria and AIDS in Africa. That would be good not only for Africans, but it would be good for the United States and Europe and Japan and Australia.
Professor Diamond, we have about 4 minutes left, and I have a couple of very interesting related questions. One person is asking, there seems to be a reversal of globalization with less international cooperation and borders going up, not down. Isn't it equally possible that COVID may accelerate these trends and make the search for a global solution to climate change even harder? And a related question to that is, how do we deal with leaders that for any reason deny the existence of climate change? What about those that defend the position of exploring as much as possible the natural resources?
Two great questions. I'll try to answer them briefly. Let's take them in reverse order. The second question, what do we do with leaders who deny and are evil and are blind? In democracies, what you do with such a leader is you vote them out of office. The United States is having an election coming up on November 3rd. We have a leader in the United States who has practiced denial and who is imperfect. Americans will form judgment on November 3rd. So in a democracy, what you can do with a leader is vote the leader out of power. The first question, yes, the questioner is absolutely right. I don't take it for granted that COVID will motivate us to rally around and solve the world's problems. There's also the risk that COVID will cause countries to be selfish, and countries will develop vaccines and they won't share the vaccines with other countries. You're right that COVID might make things worse rather than better. There again, though, remember, COVID is a teacher. If countries that develop vaccine do not share the vaccines with the world, in the short run, they will vaccinate their citizens. And in the long run, within a few weeks or a few months, they're just going to get reinfected. They'll get reinfected in the way that New Zealand and China and Australia and Vietnam got reinfected. So I rely on the teaching abilities of COVID as a teacher to make us react, protecting the whole world rather than reacting selfishly. Come back a year from now and ask me that question again, and we shall see what has happened.
And may I just ask a question from Paula, because it brings it back to your own writings. She writes, are we writing our own chapter of collapse now?
Are we writing our own chapter of collapse now? Come back next year and ask me that question. It's touch and go. In my recent books, Collapse, and in my recent book, Upheaval, I ask, are we going to solve the world's problems? People often ask me, Jared, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And my answer is, I'm a cautious optimist. By cautious optimist, I mean, I recognize that the world has big problems and that we have to solve the problems. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I rate the chances as 52% that we will solve the big problems of the world, and only 48% that we will not solve the big problems of the world. I'm cautiously optimistic. Why am I optimistic? Because young people around the world, teenagers, are taking a lead in recognizing the world's problems. Teenagers are smarter than their parents and their grandparents. That makes me optimistic. And big businesses that used to be among the most destructive forces in the world, big businesses like Walmart and even big oil companies and Unilever, big businesses are recognizing that the world's problems have to be faced at a global level. So that makes me cautiously optimistic. Therefore, I recognize that we have problems, and if we don't address those problems, we're ruined, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we will address those problems, come back again next year ask me whether I'm 53% rather than 52% optimistic. And if you would like to read my books, Upheaval and Collapse, you can read all about these problems. And I hope that my books will motivate more people to put an effort into solving these problems of the world.
We're out of time, actually, but I think I have a couple of the questions are now coming in at great speed. And there's one that I think is fascinating that says, why are there so many conspiracy theories against COVID and that are hampering the response to it?
Why are there so many conspiracy theories about COVID? That's a specific example of the broader question. Why are so many people often so blind and stupid and denying? Why is there resistance to science? It's puzzling. In my country, the United States, scientifically the most advanced country in the world, also among advanced countries, has the strongest resistance to science. Why is there this blindness about science? Science is not transparent. You look up in the sky and you see the sun moving in the sky. You don't see the earth moving in the sky. And so it took a long time for people to become convinced that the earth rotates around the sun rather than the sun rotating around the earth. And there are still people who believe that the world is flat. Look outdoors and you will see that the world is flat. Science teaches you that the world is round. But science isn't obvious. We need education. The United States, again, the world's leader in science, is also the world's leader in resistance to education about science. I live in a strange country.
Very well, Professor Diamond, thank you very, very much for your contributions. Are you willing to take a couple of more questions, or?
Of course, these are interesting questions. I can always hear myself talk. I enjoy listening to people ask questions.
All right, here's one. Would such crisis as we're facing boost our leaders to deal with unreal projects like living in Mars, rather than resolve those that are current and that are existential?
Will our leaders be motivated to deal with unreal problems rather than with real problems? It all depends upon the leader. There are good leaders and there are bad leaders. It is not appropriate for me to mention names, but all of you listeners can think of good leaders and you can think of bad leaders. I think it is appropriate for me to mention the names of good leaders. There are some countries that have good leaders. The leader of New Zealand, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, is an outstanding leader. When COVID came to New Zealand, she closed down the borders of New Zealand. And the result was that COVID disappeared in New Zealand until it came back with jet planes. Again, the Prime Minister of Australia, whose environmental policies leave something to be desired, I give him credit for having acted boldly against COVID. The Prime Minister of Australia closed down airplane flights into Australia so that there are few planes flying into Australia now, mainly just bringing back Australians. And incredibly, the Prime Minister of Australia has banned travel between all Australian states, whereas in the United States, one can travel from one American state to another state. Next week, my wife and I will travel from California to the state of Montana. Well, in Australia, that would be illegal because Australia has a much bolder, more far-sighted prime minister than do some other countries. So in short, there are leaders who tackle real problems, and there are leaders who waste their time tackling unreal problems. No names mentioned.
What will be the long-term economic effect of COVID in emerging countries? Wouldn't it be worse or better? Will it be worse or better than letting the disease run its course due to the low mortality rate?
Good question. Would it be better to let the disease run its course? Initially, when COVID broke out, there were debates. How should we deal with it? And one suggestion was, let the disease run its course. The term for that was herd immunity. Tell old people to stay home, let young people go out on the streets, get infected. They would get infected, most of them will recover, and they will then all be immune and COVID will die out. Sweden tried that policy, and it didn't work. It turned out that with people on the streets in Sweden, COVID spread in Sweden, and instead the countries in which COVID was brought under control were countries like Vietnam. Vietnam, of all countries, Vietnam learned because in 2002, Vietnam suffered from the outbreak of SARS in wild animal markets in China. And so when a new disease, COVID, broke out in Chinese wild animal markets, the Vietnamese government reacted immediately. When people in Vietnam got sick, they weren't even allowed to stay in their houses. They were taken out of their houses and they were put into special facilities, and their family members were locked down so that, and also there was tracing. Everybody in Vietnam who was exposed to someone who had COVID was tracked and was locked down. So Vietnam rather quickly suppressed COVID by tracking. The United States has done rather poorly about tracking. Korea has done well with tracking. Germany is doing well with tracking. So there are countries that are dealing well and there are countries that are dealing poorly.
How do we deal with the human habits of changing our food intake patterns? For example, the origin of COVID is the food market of wildlife animals. How can this be stopped to prevent any such diseases again from coming out?
Good question. The food markets, in 2002, China did not learn the lesson from SARS about closing down the food markets. In December, in January of this year, China did learn the lesson. When a second disease, COVID, broke out in those same food markets, China did close down the food markets. But there are other pathways for new emerging diseases to spread from wild animals to people. There are not only the wild animal markets, there's the trade in wild animals for traditional medicines, which goes on in Southeast Asia particularly, not in open air markets, but through individual traders. And unfortunately, China and Southeast Asia have not yet stopped the trade in wild animals for traditional medicine. That's another way that diseases can spread. And so, yes, the wild animal markets have been closed down, and new COVIDs are not going to spread that way, but new COVIDs are at risk of spreading from the trade in traditional medicines. Until that trade is stopped, we're going to get new COVIDs.
Is COVID-19 a planned attack on the world economy?
Is COVID-19 a planned attack on the world economy? Previously, you mentioned the paranoid fear that COVID might have been caused intentionally. There is the conspiracy theory. There are Americans who believe that COVID was created in a Chinese laboratory intentionally and spread from the Chinese laboratory. That's a conspiracy theory. Well, that conspiracy theory is not true. There's information about what went on in the Chinese laboratory that was dealing with related viruses. And we know about the wild animal market. So that conspiracy theory was not correct. Other conspiracy theories there are other conspiracy theories that are widespread in the United States. There are conspiracy theories about visitors from outer space. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories. It's a shame that people don't listen to scientific evidence that would protect them and instead believe in crazy conspiracy theories.
One of our Japanese participants comments that one of the positive effects of COVID is that it has shown how people can telework and therefore not need to travel to go to work. And that this has been a positive result. Would you comment on that?
Yes, I would comment on that. And perhaps that positive, happy note is a good note on which to conclude, because we've talked about so many miserable things and deaths and hundreds of millions of people dying. Let me take this question from your Japanese listener to end on a happy note. Yes, COVID has taught people to telecommute and to telework. As an example, I'm working at home. When COVID arrived, I was just finishing my last class at UCLA at the end of February. My final exam was given remotely. My last lecture was given in person. Now at my university, teaching is online. And when I resume teaching in January, it will be online. But I'm working at home. And I've been more productive working at home than I was before COVID, because I'm not distracted. I'm not going into my department. I'm not with my wonderful colleagues. I'm instead sitting at home, sitting at my desk writing papers. My wife, who's a clinical psychologist, instead of seeing patients in person, my wife sees her clients, her patients, over Zoom and over the telephone. And the result is that my wife and I have more time with each other than we've ever had. On the one hand, we're miserable because of the deaths of our friends. On the other hand, we're happy because we're seeing more of each other than we've ever seen of each other. And so, as your Japanese listener pointed out, yes, COVID is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy with paradoxical beneficial side consequences. And that's a happy note on which, after talking about all these unhappy things, let's end by reminding ourselves that COVID is bringing benefits. And once we get our vaccines next year, if we react well to the vaccines, the world may be a better place in the long run because of COVID. That's my optimistic note on which to end.
Thank you very much, Professor Diamond. It was an enjoyable lecture and a great set of questions, and your responses are quite illuminating. We want to thank you on behalf of all our school members and of the participants who've attended and stayed faithfully to the end. Thank you again, and I hope our paths will cross again in the not too distant future.
Thank you.